Leora had always been the obedient daughter, born into a traditional village nestled between the forest and the mountains. Her life had followed a quiet rhythm: early mornings, helping her mother knead bread, afternoons weaving baskets or tending to goats, and evenings spent by the fire, listening to stories of women who made good marriages, bore many sons, and brought honor to their families. Leora believed that would be her future too. She was modest, gentle, and beautiful in an understated way, traits praised by neighbors and envied by other girls. But what no one knew, not even Leora at first, was that her body carried a silent secret. She could not bear children. Her cycles had never been regular, and when she finally whispered her concerns to her mother, it was brushed off as stress or youth. But as she grew older and suitors began asking for her hand, her mother grew suspicious. One day, without explanation, she took Leora to a healer in a nearby town. The old woman poked, prodded, and stared too long before leaning in close to her mother and whispering the verdict: "This one won't bear fruit." Those words sealed Leora's fate. In her village, a woman's worth was tightly bound to her ability to bear children, preferably sons. Families negotiated marriages like trades, offering daughters as a way to secure alliances or wealth. An infertile daughter wasn't just an inconvenience. She was a shame, a dead investment. Leora didn't understand at first why her parents grew colder after that visit. Her mother no longer asked her to join her in the kitchen. Her father stopped mentioning the young blacksmith's son who had once eyed her with interest. Meals grew tense. The silence between them thickened. Then, one crisp autumn morning, her father returned from the market with a stranger. The man looked rugged, with a thick beard and cold eyes. He smiled too easily and lingered too long when he looked at Leora. She felt a knot twist in her stomach. "We've arranged a match for you," her mother said flatly that night. As they folded laundry in silence, Leora blinked. "A match? With who?" "A merchant," her mother said, not meeting her eyes. "He travels north. He has money, and he's agreed to take you. You'll leave tomorrow." "But," Leora's voice cracked, "I don't even know him. Why didn't you ask me?" Her mother's eyes hardened. "You're lucky someone is willing to take you at all." The next day came with no ceremony. No flowers, no blessings, no songs sung by the village women. Just a small sack of belongings thrust into her arms, and her father's hand firmly pushing her toward the merchant's cart. Leora tried to protest, to ask questions, to cry, but her voice drowned under the weight of betrayal. As the cart creaked down the dirt road, she looked back one last time, hoping for a change of heart. Her parents didn't wave. They didn't even watch her leave. The journey was long and quiet. The merchant was not cruel, but his kindness was calculated. He fed her enough to keep her healthy, spoke just enough to maintain her trust, and avoided her eyes when she asked where they were going. "I have a friend in the north," he said vaguely. "He's looking for a wife, quiet, strong, someone who won't ask too many questions." "But I'm not." "For sale," Leora whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. He glanced at her, amused. "You think your parents gave you to me for free?" That night, Leora lay awake in the back of the cart, heart pounding as she began to grasp the truth. She hadn't been married off. She had been sold. Her infertility had turned her into something less than human in her parents' eyes, a burden to be removed, a problem to be traded away. She didn't cry. Not that night. Not the next. A numbness settled in her bones, but deep inside, buried beneath the ache and betrayal, something else stirred: survival. The days blurred together as the merchant's cart rumbled across rocky trails and overgrown roads, winding deeper into unfamiliar wilderness. Leora remained quiet, clinging to the tattered blanket she'd brought from home. The man who now claimed ownership of her wasn't cruel in the overt sense. He gave her food, let her walk beside the cart when the road grew too rough, and even spoke occasionally, but his words were shallow and rehearsed, as if he'd used them many times before. "You'll be taken care of," he said one evening, as they camped near a crumbling stone bridge. "A roof over your head, food to eat. No one asks questions up north." Leora's stomach twisted. The further they traveled, the clearer it became that her fate was not to be a wife, but a transaction. She had seen the way the merchant haggled with villagers, how his face turned sharp when discussing prices. He spoke of the north not as a home, but a market. Late one night, when she pretended to sleep beneath a thin canvas tarp stretched over the cart, she overheard him speaking to another man by the fire. "Pretty one, quiet too," the merchant said. "Doctor says she can't bear children useless for breeding, but you do for company. You've got men in the camps, don't you? They get lonely." Leora felt her blood run cold. The men laughed, their voices low and rough. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Her worst fears had been confirmed. She was not being sent to a husband, but sold to laborers in some distant camp, discarded like worn-out livestock. She would be passed from hand to hand, nameless and voiceless, in a world that saw no value in her beyond the body she carried. That night, as the men snored beside the fire, Leora lay awake, heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. Her thoughts raced. She had no money, no map. She didn't even know how far north they had traveled. But she knew one thing for certain: if she didn't escape soon, she would never escape at all. The opportunity came the next evening. A sudden snowstorm blew in from the mountains, turning the dirt path into slush. The merchant cursed and yanked at the reins as the horse struggled to pull the overloaded cart through the mud. Trees bent under the weight of snow, and the wind howled through the branches like a warning. Visibility dropped quickly. The trail disappeared beneath a white sheet. "We'll camp here," he muttered, tying the horse to a pine tree and trudging off to gather firewood. Leora stood beside the cart, her fingers frozen and raw. She glanced into the forest. Dense, cold, unforgiving. But so was the life waiting for her at the end of this journey. The snow could kill her, but the camp would bury her slowly, piece by piece. Her decision was made before she even realized it. She pulled her blanket tighter, tucked a loaf of bread under her coat, and stepped silently into the trees. The snow muffled her steps, and the wind swallowed the sound of her breathing. She didn't look back. The cold bit at her legs. The wind stung her eyes. Branches slapped her face as she pushed deeper into the woods, trying to move fast but not panic. The forest was endless, and the storm made it nearly impossible to see. Still, she pressed on, guided only by instinct and desperation. Hours passed. Her limbs ached. Her vision blurred. She stumbled, fell, got back up. The bread was gone, eaten quickly to keep her energy up. Night fell fast in the woods. The snow deepened. Every step felt heavier. Eventually, her body gave in. She collapsed at the base of a tree, barely able to feel her fingers. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she thought, "This is where I end." Not sold, not broken. Just gone. A strange peace settled over her. Soft and quiet. Then dash crunch. Footsteps. Heavy ones. A figure emerged through the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an axe strapped to his back and snow clinging to his coat. He paused when he saw her, his brow furrowed with alarm. Without a word, he dropped to his knees beside her, brushing the snow from her face. Leora tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. "Please." Then darkness. The forest had gone quiet under the weight of snow, and in that silence Elias found her, a fragile shape half buried beneath a pine tree, her skin, pale lips trembling, her body near frozen. He had been out gathering wood before the storm worsened. But the sight of the girl in the snow changed everything. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light. She was more like a bundle of sticks than a person. She didn't stir as he carried her back through the forest path, leading to the cabin he had built with his own hands years ago. The cabin stood sturdy against the storm, a warm light flickering in the windows. 4 children peered through the glass wide-eyed as Elias kicked the door open and brought the girl. Inside, the oldest, Rena, quickly moved to fetch blankets while the 2 boys, Dane and Corin, helped stoke the fire little. Lottie clung to Elias's leg, eyes wide, as he laid the girl gently on the floor near the hearth. "Who is she?" Rena asked, softly watching Elias wrap the stranger in woolen furs. "I don't know," he replied, voice low, "but she won't last the night if we don't warm her up fast." Snow melted from her clothes and steam rose from her skin as the fire slowly brought color back to her face. Elias stayed close through the night, wiping her forehead, checking her breath, feeding her drops of broth between cracked lips. He'd seen cold take lives before, and he refused to let it claim this one, not when she'd somehow stumbled through the forest alone in the middle of a storm. By morning, she woke, eyes fluttering open with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up but groaned in pain. Elias rested a hand on her shoulder, steady but gentle. "You're safe now," he said. "You're in my home. You've been through something bad, but you're alive." She stared at him, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the children, the wooden walls, the fireplace, the smell of pine and stew simmering on the stove. Her body ached, but the warmth wrapped around her like a promise, one she didn't yet know how to trust over. The next few days, Leora regained her strength slowly. She said little at first, her voice hoarse from cold and fear, but the children fascinated her. Lottie brought her dolls, Rena helped her brush her tangled hair, and Corin asked her endless questions about where she came from. Elias watched it all from a careful distance, offering food, tending the fire, fixing the roof in the early morning hours when he couldn't sleep. He didn't press her for answers, not at first. He saw the guarded look in her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the nightmares that made her whimper in the night. He knew broken things when he saw them, and he knew forcing her to speak would only drive her further inward. But it asked her to do word. But slowly she began to share bits and pieces. Her name Leora, the fact that she had no family anymore, that she'd come from the south beyond the mountain line, that she hadn't meant to find this place, but the snow had forced her path. Elias listened, never interrupting, never asking for more than she offered. She began to help around the cabin, stirring soup, folding laundry, telling stories to the children in the evenings. Her presence brought a kind of calm Elias hadn't realized was missing since his wife had died years before. Raising 4 children in isolation had turned him into something quiet and hard, but Leora's arrival softened the air in the house. One morning as he returned from chopping wood, he found her outside, showing the children how to weave vines into small figures. Her laughter floated in the air, light and genuine. Elias stood in the trees, watching something in his chest shift, not with desire, but with an ache of recognition, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, life had brought someone back into their world, not by accident, but by grace. Still, he didn't let himself hope too much, not yet. He knew from the way she stared at the fire sometimes that her story wasn't finished, that whatever had brought her to his doorstep was only part of a deeper pain. But for now she was here, alive, safe, warm, and something in the silence between them began to speak, louder than words. Days turned to weeks as the snow outside deepened, burying the forest in silence and white. And within the walls of the cabin, life began to settle into a rhythm. Leora, who had once curled by the fire like a stray too frightened to speak, now moved through the house with quiet confidence, rising early to help prepare breakfast, brushing Lottie's hair while humming softly, and organizing the shelves with a care that spoke not of obligation but of intention. The children adored her each day. They clung to her like shadows, following her from room, asking questions, begging for stories, and Leora gave them what she could, fairy tales she remembered from her childhood, songs half forgotten, and lullabies once sung to her before her. Mother's voice turned to stone. Elias watched this unfolding with a cautious heart. He was a man shaped by solitude and silence, a man who had buried the love of his life 5 winters ago, and sworn he'd never feel that hollow space again. But watching Leora smile, watching her eyes crinkle when Lottie clung to her leg, or when Corin recited a poem she'd taught him, he felt something stir, not romantic, not yet, but something old and warm. And Leora never spoke about what happened before the snowstorm, not directly, not in full sentences, but Elias had lived long enough to read between the lines. He saw the way her hands shook when voices were raised, even in play, how she sometimes flinched when someone touched her shoulder. Unexpectedly, how she sat staring into the fire at night, lost in a place only she could see, one evening while the children were asleep. Leora sat at the table mending a torn sleeve, and Elias poured 2 mugs of tea, setting one gently in front of her. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the wind howling outside and the fire snapping in the hearth. Before she spoke, "I don't know where I belong," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I ever have." Elias didn't answer at first. He let the words hang there, honest and fragile. "Maybe," he said slowly, "belonging isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you build, one day at a time." Leora looked at him then, not with tears or a smile, but with a stillness that felt like trust. The days continued, and with them came small victories. Rena confided in Leora about the fear of growing up without a mother. Leora braided her hair and told her that strength wasn't about hiding pain but living through it. Corin asked Leora to teach him letters, and she spent every afternoon tracing words into the wood stove ash while he repeated them back with eager pride. Dane, who rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone, began leaving little carved animals on her bedside table, and Lottie simply began calling her Mama. Without prompting, without asking, just a quiet decision made by a child's honest heart. Leora's own heart ached with joy and fear in equal measure. She had never known this kind of love, not even from the people who had raised her. Her parents had valued her only when they believed she could give them something. Grandchildren honor legacy. The moment that illusion shattered, so had their affection. But here in a cabin, buried in snow, 4 children and a quiet man had given her something she never expected. A place, a purpose, a family, and yet a fear lingered that it might all be temporary. She hadn't told Elias the truth, not the whole of it, not the part about being sold, not the part about hearing her worth reduced to nothing because of what her body could not give. She worried that once he knew, once he saw her not just as a gentle helper or a warm voice, but as broken, discarded Barren, he might send her away too. But Elias was no fool. He saw the weight she carried, the unspoken burden, and chose not to push but to wait, and in that patience Leora found herself changing, healing, not because someone demanded it, but because no one did, because for the first time in her life she was allowed to just be, and in being she began to bloom. Winter held the forest in its grip for weeks more, but inside the cabin life had grown warm and full. Leora had become more than a guest, more than a helper. She was woven into the fabric of the household in ways that no one questioned anymore. She tended to the children as if they were her own, laughed with them, taught them, sang to them, and in return they gave her something she had never known: unconditional belonging. Elias watched this slow transformation with a heart both humbled and hesitant. He had lost before, he had loved and lost and buried, and he had never believed there would be space in his world again for someone like Leora. But she had filled the silence with meaning, not with noise, but with presence, and he had begun to think. Perhaps they had both been sent to each other for a reason. It was Rena who first uncovered the truth, not by accident, but by care. One evening while helping Leora fold the laundry, she found an old scrap of parchment tucked between the folds of a towel shawl, a note written in her mother's hand, not addressed, not signed, but unmistakable. The words cold and blunt, describing how she and her husband had accepted payment for Leora from a traveling trader, that she was barren and therefore useless, that they could no longer keep her without shame. Rena didn't mean to read it, but the words were there, clear as frost and impossible to unseesh. took the letter to Elias, heart pounding, unsure what it meant, only that it seemed wrong. Elias read it once, then again, then folded it and held it in his hand for a long time, staring into the fire. He said nothing that night, but the next morning he asked Leora to walk with him beyond the cabin near the frozen stream where the trees stood tall and quiet. When he handed her the letter, she froze, her face drained of color, and she looked as if she might run, then cry, then fall, but she did none of those things. Instead, she stood still, hands trembling, then whispered, "I didn't mean to keep it. I just couldn't forget." Elias didn't speak, and so she continued, voice cracking, as she finally shared the story she had buried deep inside. How her parents had sent her away when they discovered she couldn't bear children, how they had traded her for coin and never looked back, how the man had lied to her, told her she was going to a husband, and then tried to sell her to a labor camp. How she had escaped into the forest with nothing but fear and a blanket, how she had expected to die. Not to be saved. "I was ashamed," she said. "I thought if you knew you'd see me the way they did, as broken, as unworthy." Elias looked at her, then really looked, and the silence between them shifted from heavy to whole. He stepped closer, took the letter from her hands and dropped it into the snow, letting it melt and disappear. "You are not broken," he said, "and you are not unworthy. I didn't take you in because I needed someone to give me more children. I took you in because I saw someone who needed saving, and somehow you ended up saving us." Two tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away this time. Children accepted the truth without hesitation when Elias explained it simply, gently, without judgment. They listened, and then Rena stood and hugged Leora without a word. Dane carved a small wooden heart and gave it to her. Corin took her hand and said, "We already knew," and Lottie just smiled and said, "You're still my mama," and something shifted in Leora, a thread that had been wound too tightly inside her chest began to loosen. Not everything was healed, not every scar forgotten, but the truth was no longer a weight she carried alone. It was something she had shared, something that had been met with love, not rejection, and in that she found peace. That night, as the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, Leora sat beside Elias, not as a guest, not as a servant, but as someone who had finally been seen and chosen and still accepted. And in that quiet moment, the bond between them deepened, not with words, but with the kind of silence that speaks louder than anything else. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in thin trickles that ran between the roots of trees and under the cabin door, and as the forest awoke, so too did something inside Leora. The long, quiet season of survival had given way to something gentler, steadier. Every morning she rose before the children and watched the sun crest the hills, its light golden against the frost-kissed grass. She no longer felt like a guest in the home she once feared to enter. Now she swept the floors with a hum on her lips, stirred the stew with a sure hand, kissed Lottie's cheek, and helped Corin with his letters. She laughed at Dane's jokes and braided Rena's hair before the girl left to gather herbs. The cabin had become hers, not through ownership, but through love and presence, through the warmth she gave and the warmth she received in return. Elias had changed too, in quiet ways, the way he set out a second cup of tea without asking, or how he waited for her to speak first when they sat together in the still evenings. He no longer wore the look of a man carrying sorrow alone. Instead, his silence had softened, filled with a quiet kind of gratitude. He had stopped counting the years since his wife passed, not because he had forgotten her, but because his heart no longer measured time, only weight. And Leora, though he had never said it out loud, had lightened everything. They never spoke of love, not directly, not in the words sung in ballads or written in letters, but it was there in how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, in the way her voice steadied when she called the children in from the yard, and how her hand brushed his when they passed in the kitchen or in the garden where sprouts had begun to bloom. One day, while sorting through an old chest in the attic, Leora found a stack of unused paper, yellowed at the edges, and in the quiet of the afternoon, she sat at the table and began to write. The words came slowly, not like a story, but like a closing of something long left open. She addressed the letter to her parents, not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with Clarity, she wrote, of what had happened, of how they had cast her out, of how she had walked through snow with no direction. Only fear, and how that fear had led her to a place she never expected, a place not of wealth or promises, but of kindness and choice and belonging. She told them that though they had discarded her, she had found a family, one that did not measure her worth by what she could or could not give from her body, but by what she gave from her heart. She never sent the letter. She folded it, neatly placed it back into the chest, and left it there, not as a message to be read, but as one she had needed to speak aloud, if only to herself. Seasons passed. The forest turned green, the children grew taller and stronger, the cabin expanded slowly. Elias added a room so Leora could have a space of her own, though she rarely slept there, preferring instead to fall asleep near the fire or in the chair beside Lottie's bed. On warm evenings they sat outside under the stars, Leora telling stories while Elias carved animals from wood, and when the children were asleep, they would sit together in silence. That spoke of peace, not the peace of stillness, but the peace of being where one belongs. Eventually, the village to the south forgot her name. Her parents grew older and her story faded from their lives, but Leora did not carry that wound anymore. She had made something new from the ashes of what they burned, and in that something new she had found not just survival but meaning. She was not a wife in the way her village defined, nor a mother by birth, but in the eyes of the children she was both and more. She was love, she was safety, she was the steady heartbeat of a home built in the cold woods far from where her story began, and beside her the man who once thought he would live and die in silence had found not just company but a partner, a companion, someone who saw his quiet grief and met it with her own, and together they wove something stronger than either could have built alone. This was not the life Leora had been promised, but it was the life she chose, and in that choice she was finally free.